Welcome to MMA TRUFAN, a biographical podcast series on legendary mixed martial artists. In this episode on Dan Severn, hear exclusive interviews with Don Frye, Travis Fulton, Paul Varelans, Dan Severn, and more. Please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening.
He was the king of this sport before it was an actual sport.
The guys that were fans of the sport back then, I mean, the guy's a walking, God for the most part.
I mean, he was a father figure to me. I learned how to be a competitor from him, and watching him lead by example was the best thing for me I could see. I'm like, this man has a belief in himself. I have never seen anybody believe in himself more than he does.
MMA TRUFAN presents Dan Severn by Rich Donahue and Nate Evans.
When they asked Dan what his style was, he simply said, "I'm an American wrestler." He was backstage at UFC 4, preparing to enter his first no-holds-barred contest. The event was promoted as a brutal spectacle. The UFC was growing in popularity and drawing the ire of politicians. It began with an idea: which style is the best? Over the course of the last 3 events, many were represented: karate, kung fu, boxing, jiu-jitsu. There was one notable exception, and the 6'2", 260-pound man from Coldwater, Michigan, looked to change that. American wrestling. What's that going to do? They asked. The UFC and the world will soon find out.
Dan Severn was born on June 8, 1958, in Flint, Michigan. The Severn family lived on a large farm, and the work started early and often. Dan took us back.
There's a rule of thumb that when you get up in the morning, you have to get up and take care of the animals before you're going to get taken care of. And you better do that all before you have to walk up and catch the school bus, which is roughly about a half-mile walk down a dirt road. So, that's where I'll just say that growing up on a farm, it taught you responsibilities at a much earlier age. You had to do things early in the morning, but then you had to do it twice a day. It's like, son, do you like to eat? I go, yeah. I go, well, so do the animals. Twice a day. Once in the morning, once at night.
Between housework and school, Dan and his 7 brothers and sisters played outside, in the creek or in the woods. They fished and hunted small game. The Severns lived a humble, modest life. Sports were always a part of the Severn family. Mom and Dad had no means to send their children to college, so they had to earn it themselves. For the Severn boys, that meant sports.
In hindsight, you would think Dan walked onto the mats at a young age and never looked back. Instead, he played basketball. His brother Dave, the oldest, was the first in the family to wrestle. Dan wasn't very good at basketball, as it turned out, and spent most of the time on the bench. In 7th grade, a nasty flu swept through the Midwest middle school. Some of the guys on the wrestling team got so sick they couldn't compete at an upcoming meet. A couple of Dan's friends asked him if he could fill in a weight class so they wouldn't have to forfeit.
Did a young Dan Severn, a boy who would one day be known as the Beast, stride in as a substitute and triumph that night? Dan lost both matches, handedly, and returned to the basketball team to ride the bench for the rest of the season. Dan was embarrassed. He was always a big, strong kid. Dan thought that would be enough to save the day for his friends. Nevertheless, he got a taste for it, and signed up for the team that next year. There were still some growing pains in his first full year wrestling. He got his butt kicked for the most part, but stuck with it, and signed up for his freshman year in high school. His coach, Tom Castile, kept copies of amateur wrestling news in his office. Dan read through them, and was exposed to what it truly took to become a successful wrestler. It detailed drills, diet plans, mental exercises, etc.
Dan was tired of being a doormat. He wanted to make a splash, so he had the idea of making history at his high school by becoming the first freshman to make the varsity squad. He challenged at his natural weight, 165, and failed. Dan didn't give up, challenging every conceivable weight class he could. Shockingly, he defeated the heavyweight wrestler and took his spot. Dan had done it. This wouldn't be the last time Dan Severn set a goal for himself and accomplished it. So now we have Dan, a 165-pound freshman, matched up against seniors weighing as much as 300 pounds. While his teammates cut weight for meets, Dan drank water and weighed in with stuff in his pockets. He got beat up again, but not as bad as you would think. He learned to deal with the enormous size difference, and sometimes pull out a win, to the delight of the crowd. He finished just below 500, which is quite an accomplishment considering the circumstances.
Dan, along with his older brother Dave, became obsessed with the sport. Dan sailed in at 185 pounds, and wrestled year-round. The Severn brothers scoured each new issue of amateur wrestling news, taking in any knowledge they could and applying it in practice. They pushed each other, as Dan explains.
He's what made me what I am today. It's called sibling rivalry, you know. He would set the bar, and then being the younger sibling, I had to try to push that bar a little further. You know, that's what I always said, that you're only as good as your workout partners, and literally my older brother Dave and I, we were each other's workout partners too, to where, I mean, sometimes it was a little bit more heated type of a team being back at home because, you know, he either got the better of me or I got the better of him in practice, and that's, you know, that's not so much fun when you're back home on the farm now. You gotta go do chores together, and I'm low man on the totem pole. I'm getting the crap out of the jobs now. They
would seek out wrestling events in the area and began traveling all over the state and beyond in AAU and USWF events. For those organizations, the Severns wrestled freestyle and Greco-Roman, which complemented the folk-style wrestling they were doing during the season. It was a time before GPS and Google Maps.
I was my brother's GPS because I was not of legal age to drive, but I would be sitting in the passenger seat with the road atlas, and I would be telling them, you know, what terms that are coming up. And on any given Friday, Saturday, or even a Sunday, we would be traveling either inside the state of Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, or going across the bridge into Canada, because you did not need a passport or any kind of a special driver's license. You just simply drove across, nationality, U.S., see you later.
Dan not only competed year-round in wrestling, but found time to excel for the school's track and football teams. In his junior year, he went undefeated with 51 wins and set a national pin record with 43. Dan went from reading amateur wrestling news to being in it. That same year, both Dave and Dan won the state title. Just like when he tried out for his freshman year, Dan wanted to make another splash in the wrestling scene. He wanted to get colleges to notice him and stand out from his brother.
One day, Dan entered a tournament to compete in 3 different weight classes, in both the junior and open age divisions. It was an outlandish thing to do. In the open age division, Dan would be going up against college wrestlers, or even older. Since he was competing in 6 different tournaments at once, Dan had to move quickly.
I might be on mat number 1. I might be on deck on mat number 2. I might be in the hole on mat number 3. And the moment that they announce that Dan Severn must report to mat number whatever, the clock started. You had 5 minutes. Otherwise, you would be disqualified. And in one day, I did 2 age groups, 6 weight classes, 17 matches later, and I walked out of that gymnasium with 6 gold medals. The wrestling world was talking because 17 matches in one day.
In his senior year, Dan somehow topped his junior campaign by not only going undefeated, but pinning every single one of his opponents. He set 8 national records to finish his high school career, which was a record in of itself. But that wasn't enough. That summer, he won the 1976 national championships in both Greco-Roman and freestyle.
Dan Severn, quite simply, had the world in the palm of his hand.
You know, 1976, I am the number 1 recruit at my weight class at the 185-pound weight class. So it worked out for me, and I had the academics to go along with it.
He was the most heavily recruited wrestler in the nation once he graduated. He was wined and dined at all the big programs. Russ Hellickson, a wrestling legend in his own right, was an assistant coach for the University of Wisconsin at the time.
Oh, yeah, we tried to recruit him at Wisconsin. He could turn anybody. He could take people down. He was a wild man when he was wrestling. He was the kind of guy you want to have in your wrestling room. You know, we thought that, he'd be a good guy to come into Wisconsin. We'd have loved to have him.
He ended up signing with the Arizona State Sun Devils. Not only was Dave already there, but ASU sweetened the deal during his recruitment visit.
I made it very well known that I always felt that I was a better international wrestler, freestyle Greco, than I was a folk styler, and that I would probably side with a program that had the best of both worlds. When I went out to Arizona, a luncheon with Bobby Douglas and one of the former alumnus, and he said that I heard that you'll side with whatever college that has the best of both worlds. And I said, what? And he says, well, I said, you don't know me, but he says, if you sign with Arizona State, I will start up a freestyle wrestling program for you.
Dan was the first member of the legendary Sunkist Kids Wrestling Club. Since its inception, it's gone on to produce more Olympic, world, and U.S. national champions than any other club in the United States.
Dan was shot out of a cannon in his freshman year. He went 34-0 with 26 pins. But a week before the conference championship, Dan suffered a brutal knee injury in a meet. He begged to finish the match and ended up winning by pin. He limped off the mat and into a hospital for surgery. Dan lost a year recovering, and when he finally returned to ASU, his body couldn't stay healthy. Dan never had a complete season wrestling for ASU. He suffered other injuries to his shoulder and neck. Despite the setbacks, he still managed to be named All-American 2 times, and was a runner-up in the 1980 National Championship his junior year. Dan finished his college career by being pinned only once, during the 1981 National Championship, the last match of his senior year. The man that did that was Steve Williams, long before he'd rule the pro wrestling world as Dr. Death.
After graduation, Dan became an assistant coach for ASU. He wanted to continue to compete, and set his sights on the Olympics. For the 1984 Olympic trials, Dan challenged at heavyweight. His opponent was Lou Bonnick, who won the NCAA National Championship for Iowa in 1981 and 1983. It was the best-of-3 contest. During the rubber match, Dan pinned Bonnick with 40 seconds remaining, or so he thought. The trials were officiated by 3 referees. One awarded Dan the pin, but the others did not. After a conference, they ruled to continue the match. Not only did Dan not win outright, he was not granted the points he earned leveraging for the pin. This would have given him the lead in the match, but that didn't happen. He was behind with not enough time. He was robbed and furious. The trials were videotaped, and using that evidence, Dan filed a formal complaint with USA Wrestling. When that didn't go anywhere, he had to accept it. He didn't have the money or the connections to keep fighting the ruling. All he would end up doing is get blackballed and ruin any future he had in the sport. Dan was an alternate and attended the games. He watched Bonnick win, essentially his gold medal.
I had to sit up in the bleachers and watch Lou Bannick. Again, I hold nothing against Lou Bannick. I mean, he went out there and did what he did. He went out there and did not give up a single point. Every person that he beat, I had pinned in under 1 minute.
Dan was seething with anger, and he took it out on his competitors and his teammates.
I have a good poker face. Most people will never know when I'm angry because I'll smile. There's an old song that says, "Smiling faces don't leave traces of the evil that lurks within."
The beast began to emerge. For the next 2 years, he dominated international competition.
1984, from 84 to 86, I ruled the world, and it's because I had anger issues. And I took it out on a lot of my opponents, punishing them, throwing them reckless abandonment, throwing them with male harm. Because, again, I wish I could have grabbed some of the USA wrestling officials. That's who I really wanted to do it to.
From 1984 to 1994, Dan traveled the world competing in AAU tournaments. Before he walked into the UFC cage for the first time, he would amass 13 AAU championships. All the while, he continued coaching at ASU and got married. In 1986, Dan and his wife Terry moved back to Lansing, Michigan. Dan became assistant coach at Michigan State University. With his help, the Spartans went from being basement dwellers to one of the top 4 teams in the conference. Dan coached, but was still training himself. He made a run for the 1988 Olympics, but suffered another knee injury and finished 6th. At Michigan State, things were going well for a couple of years, until head coach Phil Parker began to act strangely. He began encroaching on Severn's training sessions, trying to show him up. The wrestlers told Dan in private that they were not being paid their daily stipend of $15. Dan suspected Coach Parker was embezzling money.
Prior to the 1989 Big Ten Championships, Parker gave Dan permission to leave the team to compete in a tournament. With the team solely under Coach Parker's care, things went horribly wrong. The athletes were left stranded at the weigh-ins, and then again at the hotel. The championship weekend was an embarrassment to Michigan State. Athletic Director Doug Weaver wanted answers. He read Coach Parker the riot act, and in the process, Parker tried to throw Dan under the bus. He said he never gave Dan permission to leave and compete. Dan saw the writing on the wall. Doug didn't have a lot of love for the wrestling program and wanted to eliminate it This blunder may have given him the chance. Not only that, Phil was trying to pin it on him. He was told to take a little vacation, but Dan packed his office instead. Dan negotiated his way out of Michigan State with a letter of recommendation from Weaver and a weekly paycheck mailed to his home until his contract was up.
Terry and Dan, now young parents of 2 children, bought a home and moved to Coldwater, Michigan. Dan became head coach of the Michigan Wrestling Club and worked as a manager of a tool and die shop. Within a year, the plant closed and Dan was unemployed. During this time, the U.S. Olympic Committee instituted a new rule, which opened up new possibilities.
As of the 1992 Olympics, a new rule came down from the United States Olympic Committee that allowed athletes to be both amateur and professional simultaneously, as long as you were not involved in a high school athletic program or a collegiate athletic program, because you would still be governed by high school athletic association rules or the NCAA rules. Well, I was already well past my collegiate eligibility, so I could have my cake and eat it too. I could be a professional wrestler, and I could still be an amateur wrestler.
Dan was in desperate need of money and recognized this potential game changer, but didn't have the right opportunity. He found one at the Michigan Wrestling Club.
Dennis Kaspowitz was the president of the club, but he's better known by a different name, Denny Cass. He moonlighted as a professional wrestler for Motor City Wrestling.
I would, whenever our club duties were done, I would always pick his brain about professional wrestling. And when this new rule came down, I brought it to his attention. He goes, well, he says, and again, he painted a very dark and dreary picture of the business.
Dan wasn't deterred. Soon enough, Dennis drove Dan to Body Slammers Gym in Lima, Ohio. Body Slammers was owned by Dennis's tag partner, future WWE superstar Al Snow. It was a dingy, small place, but Al was a quality teacher. Severn began traveling 2 hours 3 times a week to learn the art of professional wrestling.
I got a lot of time invested into just one workout, and I kept thinking, not to sound rude or anything, but when guys would be standing there in the ring and they would be talking, I might go, guys, can you talk outside the ring? I just want to get in the ring and run ropes and take turnbuckles and keep drilling and drilling and drilling.
Dan wrestled as if his life depended on it, because it did. He had a mortgage to pay for and mouths to feed. He wrestled in small shows in the area, sometimes against Al or against his masked persona, Shinobi. At one of the shows, he saw a poster advertising a Tough Man competition. The winner would receive $1,000. Dan was conflicted. He never punched anyone in his life, but he really needed that money, so he signed up.
At the venue, Dan saw how crazy this event really was. It was held over 2 days. To win, you had to beat 6 other men. There were really no rules at all. The competitors wore headgear and 16-ounce gloves, but otherwise, it was the Wild West. Dan had his reservations, but when he stepped into the ring, the Beast made an appearance once again. He mopped the competition, throwing them all over the ring, and took home the grand prize. During one of his wrestling shows, Dan met Candy Burton. Candy's husband, Tom, wrestled for an organization in Japan called UWFI. Dan incorporated a lot of amateur techniques into his matches, which caught Candy's eye. Through the grapevine, Candy heard of Dan's amateur wrestling background. He seemed like a perfect fit for UWFI, and eventually, he signed with them.
In Japan, pro wrestling is big business. There are many different organizations there, expressing themselves in different ways. Some imitated the product we see in America. Others, like UWFI, was what they called strong style. They stylized themselves as legitimate and employed wrestlers with real combat sport backgrounds. The matches were worked stiff, with punches and kicks being thrown at full power. Dan began traveling back and forth to Japan for matches, staying about 4 days at a time. The travel was brutal, but UWFI paid far better than what he was getting paid in the U.S. It was an education for Dan, but in reality he couldn't stand it.
What bothered Dan Severn is when I had to go over there and I had to do the job for a guy that can't even carry my jock strap. So yeah, that bothered me. I was involved in a tag match against 2 Russians, and Gary Albright was my tag team partner. And all I know is that between the 4 of us, I'm the only guy in shape. The other 3 are going to be winded just getting out to the ring. And I'm like, and I'm the guy that's got to lose out here?
UWFI was founded by Nobuhiko Takada, the man that would go on to help create prize-fighting championships. Takada was the biggest star of the show, fearsome in the ring. He was UWF-I's champion, and wore an old NWA championship belt. It was given to Takada by the legendary Lou Thez. In reality, however, Takada was a subpar athlete. UWF-I stocked its roster with other wrestlers Dan knew from the international wrestling scene. Dan, or any of these men, would have wiped the mat with Takada. Instead, Dan was paid to put Takada and other Japanese stars over. Since UWF-I was going for a legitimate look, they made it seem like Takada could easily handle the NCAA and world champions on the roster. Dan was being paid to sacrifice his hard-earned reputation as a wrestling powerhouse.
Dan was approached by a man named Glenn Bailey. Glenn wanted to work with Dan and develop a new combat training program for law enforcement and corrections officers. They co-signed a loan for $40,000 and put together a regimen that was more effective and easier to learn than what was standard at the time. When it came time to pay back the debt, Glenn disappeared. Dan didn't sell anything yet and was now on the hook for $40,000. Later on, Dan would repackage the program, calling it Danger Zone. It became a success, and he continues to sell the program to this day, being booked for training seminars around the globe. At this point, however, this was a devastating blow. He was barely treading water as it was, and now he was in serious financial trouble. Something had to give.
Dan's friend Eric came over one night to show him a tape of a new show that was taking America by storm, the Ultimate Fighting Championship. He watched the first 2 pay-per-views and couldn't believe what he was seeing.
I'm watching this. I'm seeing people being soccer kicked in the face. I'm seeing teeth flying out. And I'm looking at my buddy and I'm like, these are not exactly skills that I possess. But then he points Gracie and he says, well, look at this little guy doing jiu-jitsu. And I'm watching him do his jiu-jitsu. I kept thinking, well, makes sense to me.
It was a different style of grappling, but it was grappling nonetheless. Dan thought that maybe he should try to get involved with this, especially after he saw the victorious Gracie hold an obnoxiously large check above his head for $50,000.
With the help of his manager, Phyllis Lee, Dan applied to be part of UFC 3. He was rejected. To try to convince the UFC brass to take another shot at Dan for the following tournament, Phyllis invited co-founder Art Davie to a wrestling match between Dan and Road Warrior Hawk. After the match, Dan went backstage and met Davie.
Match is done, and now I'm back there, and I'm being introduced to Art Davie, and I'm hello, there was Davie, and he basically goes right to business and goes, well, he goes, you do realize what we do is real, don't you? And I go, well, yes, I do. And what is, I go, what's your professional fight record? Well, I don't have one of those. He said, well, what's your average fight record? I said, well, I don't have one of those either. And then he's always kind of looking at me frustrated. He's like, oh, well, what are your skills that you think you can get in this octagon? And I kind of realized I'm about to be, blown off at this point in time. And I think we're going to go, well, Mr. Davie, I may not have a professional fight record. I may not have an average fight record. But obviously, you have never witnessed international freestyle or Greco-Roman competition. It'll be the closest thing you'll ever see to one of your UFC-style matches. Well, I piqued his curiosity. He goes, well, what do you mean? I said, well, let me reiterate my very first international experience ever. At 17 years of age, I'm part of a junior age group, 16 to 18-year-old age group bracket, and Americans, and we're heading over to the country of Turkey to wrestle. And we're supposed to be wrestling other Turkish wrestlers between 16 to 18 years of age. Well, my first opponent is a 35-year-old military man, fully aged, combination of beatness, ugliness, and just strength and just orbiness, and he's like this caged animal as he's just walking back and forth. Just can't wait to get a piece of this weedy looking American, because obviously I was 17 years of age, a lot more hair on my head at that time, and I go out there and the referee starts the match, and my opponent basically does what was known as a collar tie, where he reached up, cups the back of my head, and he grabs a wad of my hair on my head, and basically pulls it back, to where my head arched that up, and then he headbutts me, splitting my eyebrow open. And then, to add insult to injury, he pulls a wad of hair out of my head and throws it down on the ground. So as I'm backpedaling, my hand is up on the eyebrow, blood's trickling out down, and I'm looking at the referee like, well, this match should be stopped. My opponent should be disqualified for unsportsmanlike conduct. And the referee simply steps out in between us and kicks the tuft of hair out of the way and cautions me for passivity, saying that I'm stalling in this match. This happens in the opening, say, 15, 20 seconds of the first 3-minute period. And I'm like, all right, so referee is now related to my wrestler. There is no rules in this match. Now I'm pissed. I go to work. I hit him with one of the most vicious double leg takedowns. He hits hard and fast. Technique called a crossface. Take the bony portion of your arm across soft facial tissue. You can be nice and put it in short range, or if you're a little bit more motivated, you can cock it back and drive it like a hammer. Well, I drove that hammer right into that anvil, is what I did. And I knew that I broke his nose because I had blood pouring out on my arm. But then all of a sudden, he bites into my forearm, trying to take a chunk of meat out of my forearm. And that's when it's like, that's it. I want to kill you now. And you can bury you out in the sand dunes. I don't care. I basically reached out and grabbed my free arm, grabbed the arm that was in the crossface position, and I rolled it up to where I was going to jam the cartilage and all that back into the black hole of space, and they could bury his corpse out in the sand dunes. I don't care at this point in time. He wants to go this route. I'll play this route here right now.
Dan was accepted into the next tournament and trained at Body Slammers for about a week prior to the show. This was nowhere near the meticulous, multifaceted training you see in today's MMA training camps. Dan was surrounded by Al and his fellow professional wrestlers. They shared one pair of boxing gloves and basically experimented. Dan worked with Al to help apply his amateur and pro wrestling skills in an actual fight. This was new to everyone. They were guessing. Dan told us about his mindset.
I don't know how much more matter-of-factly I could have said it. I have never been in a fight in my entire life, but I've been a competitor my entire life. Again, when I talk about the wrestler, striking, you can't strike in wrestling. I mean, I use actual legitimate technique. I mean, I might have taken, again, nothing I ever did was truly illegal. It's just that, the body gives out. There's only a certain range of motion on a shoulder or an elbow or a knee.
When UWFI found out what Dan was doing, they were upset. They wanted Dan making money for them, and if he lost in the UFC, it would be a blight on their organization. They said if he continued, he would be booked far less and with worse matchups. None of that mattered to Dan. He hated the traveling and the organization. If he won the UFC tournament, it would be 6 times more than one UWFI match. He hung up the phone and never returned.
Dan made his professional mixed martial arts debut at the age of 36 at UFC 4, Revenge of the Warriors. It was held at the Expo Center Pavilion in Tulsa, Oklahoma on December 16, 1994. The bouts would have no time limit, no weight limit, and no judges. The only 2 rules were no biting and no eye gouging. Backstage, the production people gathered information on each fighter for the tale of the tape. They asked him, "What's your style?" "I'm an American wrestler." "American wrestling? What's that going to do?" they replied. "I'm not sure," Dan said. "I guess you'll have to watch and see."
His first opponent was Anthony Mad Dog Macias, a Muay Thai kickboxer. He was a pure striker, holding black belts in both karate and taekwondo. He was the hometown favorite, but much smaller than Dan, only 5'10", 170 pounds. The bell sounded, and Anthony circled Dan, throwing out a couple of kicks. Dan quickly closed the distance and shot for a takedown. Once he got a hold of Macias, Dan noticed something.
Anthony Macias, his entire body was covered in baby oil. He was slicker than a greased pig. Had I gotten off the very first throw, it would have been a belly-to-belly launched backwards. That could have probably ended the match right there. pads around his waist. He's all greased up. The only thing that stops my arms from sliding off his body is because my arms hit his armpits. Literally, I ended up landing on my own back. I ate a lot of I ate a lot of elbows. I finally got back up to my feet.
Dan reversed the position, got behind Macias, and showed how effective American wrestling can be in the UFC. He launched Macias onto his head with a belly-to-back suplex, and the crowd roared.
Basically, it dazed him a little bit, but he comes right back up to his feet. And he throws my head taken off to the side. He throws back an elbow. He hits me with a shot, and I make a, damn it. In my mind, I'm like, you think that first belly to back hurt? Wait until you feel this.
He launched him again, this time more cleanly. The force of the impact was so great, Macias folded in half, hitting himself with his own knee, cutting him open. He tried to shake the cobwebs out, but Dan was all over him, transitioning to his back. Dan didn't really know what to do in that position. He clearly had Macias on the ropes, but didn't have any formal submission training. He forced his left arm under Macias' throat, applied pressure, and he tapped. It wasn't the best technique, but it worked. Dan popped up, lifted his arms above his head, and screamed. The crowd went from booing Dan to erupting in his favor. He was a favorite to win the whole thing.
Dan's devastating slams that night became one of the UFC's greatest highlights of all time. You can't mention slams in MMA without first mentioning Dan Severn's debut performance.
I sure did make a pretty good impression in my very first match. Literally.
Dan's next opponent was supposed to be Steve Jenham, but he had to bow out due to injury. He was replaced by a third-degree black belt in karate, Marcus Bissett. He was an opposing figure, much closer in size to Dan than Anthony was. He opened the fight with a stiff kick to Severn's body. It was the type of attack he was used to taking back in UWFI. Unlike then, though, he didn't have to roll over for a paycheck. Bassett threw a roundhouse kick to Severn's head, which he ducked. Bassett tried to pivot for another spinning kick, but Dan was already on him, taking him down and mounting him. In less than a minute, he choked Marcus with an arm triangle and punched his ticket to the finals. Dan was feeling great backstage. He'd spent a total of 2 minutes in the cage, and without throwing a single punch, was one win away from the championship and $63,000. He faced Royce Gracie in the finals.
Now Dan faced a true grappler for the first time. Royce stood across from Dan, stoic, with a slight mouse under his eye. Dan bounced on his feet, ready to take home the grand prize. After a brief feeling out period, Dan got the takedown and was in Gracie's guard. For the better part of 16 minutes, Dan controlled Gracie from the top position. He stayed heavy, grinding his forearms into Royce's face. He attempted some submission holds, but they were useless against Gracie. There was no time limit, and Dan had to change up his tactics to get a finish. He had to strike, but couldn't, at least not with any effectiveness. Commitment is one of the keys to a powerful strike. You can't hold back. Dan's success that night came from the decades he spent on the wrestling mat. But right then, in the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu guard for the first time, it was a hindrance. He threw a few punches, but he couldn't do what he needed to do to finish Royce. At the 15-minute mark, Royce was pinned in the cage corner. He pivoted under Dan and threw his legs above Dan's head. It looked harmless to the audience that night, but we were uneducated in the art of jiu-jitsu. Even the commentators dismissed any sort of threat Dan might be in. At 15 minutes 49 seconds, Dan was submitted by the first triangle choke in UFC history.
Had I ever heard of a triangle choke? No. Well, again, when you look at my first two matches that I competed in the UFC number 4, did I strike any of my opponents in my first two matches? No. Being out there, I was an amateur wrestler. An amateur wrestler in a very barbaric sport. And even with Royce, I eventually did throw something, but all very peripheral to the side. Because, and I tell people all the time, I was more torn with my conscience than ever with an opponent, because I had to go against, at that point in time, 26 or 27 years of rules and regulation and sportsmanship that has been, instilled in me.
And with the exception of those in attendance, no one got to see it. This was the early days of cable pay-per-view, and the owners of the UFC only bought a 2.5-hour time slot. Halfway through the finals, they ran out of time, and the broadcast suddenly cut to black. It was a PR disaster. Customers were sent free videos of the match, or refunded their money. This match was the catalyst to institute time limits in bouts going forward. Dan lost, But his showdown in wrestling was more than a match for jiu-jitsu. It was possible that the Gracies weren't as invincible as many thought.
Being a runner-up at UFC 4 gave Dan an automatic entry into UFC 5. It wouldn't be held until 3 months later, and Dan kept busy. He turned a barn on his property into a training facility, and started to hold wrestling classes there. Dan's success at UFC 4 granted him some new opportunities. One of them was meeting Dennis Coralluzzo, promoted for the National Wrestling Alliance. The NWA was a legendary promotion, but WWF's popularity was killing off all of his competition. The NWA wasn't immune. Dennis wanted to boost the brand by putting the belt on Dan. Dan defeated Chris Candido to win the NWA Championship belt.
It was the perfect fit. The NWA Championship was formally established in 1948. The NWA acted as a governing body over many promotions, and the NWA champion would travel to these different territories, challenging the local champion. The most dominant champion in NWA history was Lou Thesz, who held the title 3 times for a total of 10 years. He was a true shooter with legitimate wrestling credentials. He is credited with inventing many pro wrestling moves, such as the belly-to-back suplex, the move Dan would use to win his first UFC match.
It's many times what Ric Flair's called himself the man. Lou Thesz was the man, just for the sheer amount of time he held on to the NWA belt. And his reflection onto the NWA belt, how he conducted himself. These are all the qualities that, when I first met Lou, it was in Japan. Again, I was naive at that point in time. I didn't say much, but then, after I would learn that, I met a Billy Robinson. Okay, now I met, Lou Thesz, find out a little bit more about this gentleman. The more I found out, the more I was awestruck.
Dan Severn was always a throwback athlete. With his thick mustache and wrestling trunks, he looked like he just stepped out of a time machine. In many ways, Dan Severn was the modern-day Lou Thesz. Both are proud to represent wrestling and perform at a high level. Both exuded class and toughness. There was no better candidate to continue the tradition of NWA champion. He would go on to hold the belt for 4 years, making it the third longest reign in its history.
To prepare for UFC 5, Severn went back to Arizona, to the Sunkist Kids.
I took out 32 days of my life, and I prepared to be a no-holds-barred competitor. And most are not going to understand what I mean when I say that. Because you have to go back to that time period, and there was only 2 rules: no biting, no eye gouging. So I took out time, and I prepared. I moved away from my family. I was not going to be a father of. I was not going to be a husband to. I had to become a no-holds-barred fighter. Desensitized, and it worked.
Between the members of the club and ASU's wrestling team, he wasn't short on quality partners. You need steel to sharpen steel. Paul Bowers experienced a similar situation during the time he trained with Dan years later.
If you get a bunch of wrestlers in a room, it doesn't matter what you're training for, it's going to be a hard workout, Nobody gives up, nobody quits.
He hooked up with a man named Richard Hamilton, who was running a program teaching students how to run a combat sports center. His program offered not only business and accounting classes, but real combat training. With Richard's help, Dan put himself through a proper MMA training camp. He was cross-trained in multiple styles. He trained in submissions and sparred. There wouldn't be any hesitation this time. The tournament would be his for the taking.
UFC 5 took place in Charlotte, North Carolina, on April 7th, 1995. Dan wanted revenge against Hoyce, but wouldn't get the chance. This show introduced the Super Fight Championship, a standalone fight separate from the tournament. The inaugural bout will be between Gracie and Ken Shamrock in the main event. For Dan's first match, he was opposed by judo black belt Joe Charles. Dan walked to the octagon proudly displaying his NWA Championship belt, the first and only man to brandish a wrestling championship belt in the octagon. Dan's training was evident right away. He took Joe down immediately and began raining huge knees, punches, and elbows to Charles's face. He was aggressive, opening up a cut on Charles's face. Joe then used an armbar attempt to create a small window to escape. He turned away from Severn and tried to use the cage to pull himself back to his feet. Dan threw his arms around Charles's neck, peeling him from the cage and locking in a rear naked choke at 1 minute, 38 seconds.
In the semifinals, Dan faced the Russian Bear, Oleg Tektarov. Dan was very familiar with Russian grapplers, and he knew the Sambo expert from Gorky, Russia would be extremely tough.
Most people don't understand the Russian mentality. In the sport of amateur wrestling, they're the best technicians. Their only true flaw for a long time was they were never known as very good conditioners, cardiovascular conditioners. So I simply knew that The only information I'm giving this right now, I've got a guy that's been undefeated for just over a decade, and he's a Russian. I simply know that going into this match, I'm going to have to half kill a man in order to beat him.
Dan snapped Oleg down with a head and arm lock and got busy right away, raining punches from Oleg's guard. Severn postured up, shucked Oleg's legs aside, and took side control. From there, he dropped huge knees to Oleg's head, splitting him open. Travis Fulton, veteran of over 300 pro fights, fought Dan 4 times. He knows exactly how those knees felt.
Dan, he was just so strong, and I couldn't do anything against him, and he felt like a truck weighing on top of me, and those knees, they became famous for in the UFC, it was legal back in those days still, and I could see why a lot of guys were folding under them, because they hurt. So, he actually got the north-south position on me and landed a couple of them, and it sucked.
But that wasn't enough to finish him. Severn turned up the gas, working Oleg's cut with hammer strikes and headbutts. The Russian Bear was a bloody mess, and forced Big John McCarthy to stop the bout at 4 minutes 21 seconds.
The Beast was feasting, and the crowd couldn't get enough. In the finals, Dan faced Canadian wrestler and judoka Dave Benetow. They tied up right away, and Dan drove him to the fence. Dave was crafty, though, scoring with some dirty boxing and a nice counter uppercut. Once Dan regained control, he tripped Dave to the floor and applied a key lock for the win. He was the UFC 5 champion. His corner rushed the cage, and during the celebration, Dennis Coralluzzo put the NWA belt on Dan's shoulder. Ron Van Cleef presented Dan with the UFC 5 championship belt, and he placed it on his other shoulder. Dan Severn, the farm boy from Michigan, who, through grit and undeniable will, took wrestling from the mats to the cage. Dan hoisted each belt in his hands and held them aloft. An indelible image in the history of mixed martial arts.
Dan became the first fighter to hold the professional wrestling world title and UFC championship simultaneously. To close the broadcast, commentator Bruce Beck commented on Dan's vast improvements since his last UFC appearance. Commentator Jim Brown agreed. Different guy. He's a beast now, an animal. Not many people can say they got their nickname from the greatest professional football player of all time.
In the super fight, Hoist and Ken fought to a draw. They used a maximum amount of time, and since there were no judges, no decision could be made. The introduction of time limits to UFC bouts made the Gracies uncomfortable. Horian wanted to keep the matches pure, free from as many limitations as possible. UFC veteran Paul Varelans.
Without the Gracie family doing what they did, they were amazing marketers. Once they did the first two UFCs, they lost. They didn't want to own the UFC anymore. They proved what they wanted to prove, that their style of jiu-jitsu was the most influential and probably best style of jiu-jitsu that there was for fighting.
Recognizing the UFC was going to be run more like a television show than a martial arts contest, Horian sold his shares in the company. Hoist followed his brother and left the organization. Dan's win earned him the right to face the super fight champion, and without Gracie, UFC executives turned to Ken Shamrock. In the 2 months leading up to UFC 6, Dan didn't sit still. The newly crowned champion went right back to Coldwater to run his training facility. At first, he was holding seminars in his barn, but he grew the investment into a large facility.
He wrestled in shows throughout the East Coast. In fact, since Dan walked into Body Slammer's gym, he continued to compete in the professional wrestling ring, regardless of his MMA, coaching, or public speaking obligations. Dan was what you would call a workaholic, maximizing his time whenever possible. He didn't set aside any time to prepare for Ken because he didn't take him seriously as a competitor.
Well, it was, I was ill. But at the same token, I still fulfilled my obligation. The show goes on. But at the same token, I was a little bit more torn with even giving him a match in the very first place, because in order to be a super fight, you have to go against people that have won things. Ken had not won anything up to that point. So how is that a super bout?
He considered backing out, but he knew how much money was being spent on this production. He had to keep his commitment. On July 14th, 1995, Ken Shamrock defeated Dan Severn by guillotine choke to earn the inaugural Super Fight Championship. Dan just wasn't himself, and it was over before it started.
Dan licked his wounds and wanted revenge against his rival from California. As Ken toured the nation, defending his Super Fight Championship against Oleg Tektarov and Kimo Leopoldo, Dan toured Japan as the NWA champion. When he returned, he set his mind to winning the UFC title. He flew back out to Arizona for another training camp with Richard Hamilton and the collective might of Arizona's amateur wrestling program. Dan trained with many young athletes who would go on to have great success in MMA, such as Mark Kerr and Don Frye. Dan was one of Don's wrestling coaches at ASU. Frye credits Severn as the guy who got him into mixed martial arts.
I didn't see him for years, and then I was at the fire department and saw him on, I watched him on the UFC, I think number 4, and then number 5. And then I was at the fire department, and he was doing a bodyguard gig in New York City. I found his number, I called him up, and I said, "Hey, Dan, Don Frye, remember me?" He said, "Yeah, of course. Can you get me in on this stuff, And he said, "Sure." And so he got me a couple of fights across the country, and they end up, not being paid, and bad promoter. And but I guess that was his way of seeing if I really wanted to be a fighter or not, because most of these turds nowadays, the first thing they do is, they're not fighters, they're negotiators. Shit. Criminy, are you going to fight, or are you going to sell used cars?
Don continues.
Like I said, he got me some fights across the country, and then he was getting ready for the ultimate. And, I said, "You need some, the body to help." And he says, "Yeah." Because Dan's pretty much doing it by himself. I went up there where he was training and stayed up there and trained with him for like 6 weeks. I took that much time off of work, at the fire department. And, I was his chief throwing dummy. He threw me around for, 4 or 6 weeks, getting ready for the ultimate. And then, and then when it's time to go there, all of a sudden, 6 other people show up, and want to be in his entourage. And they're claiming to be, be his workout partner. And I said, "Really? I haven't seen you last this fucking 6 weeks. Where you been?"
Dan was going to be a part of the Ultimate, UFC's first super tournament. The entire bracket would consist of past winners or runners-up. The winner would receive the largest purse yet, $150,000. Dan's training camp went fantastic, and he was in great shape. He had to be, in order to contend with the caliber of fighters in the tournament, and the elevation. Ultimate 95 took place where it all started, in Denver, Colorado, on December 16, 1995. For the first time, UFC told the competitors who their first opponent would be ahead of time. He was slated to face kickboxer Pat Smith, but after failing his medical evaluation, he was replaced the night before by the polar bear Paul Varelans. Varelans competed in UFC 6 and 7, losing to Marco Huas in the finals. He was a massive figure, 6'8" and 300 pounds. He specialized in trap fighting, a unique catch wrestling style that utilized elbows from a close range.
He was an entirely different kind of opponent than the one Dan was preparing to face. In the end, it didn't matter. Dan quickly took the big man down and controlled Varelans from the side position. He locked in an arm triangle choke, beating the polar bear in less than 2 minutes.
Look at any of my fights, I've never tapped out. I mean, Dan didn't even, he doesn't remember this, but he didn't want to choke me out. Like, when he had me in the middle of the ring, he'd go, "Come on, bro, let's just tap. I don't want to choke you." I'm like, "Dude, you got to do it, man. I don't tap. That's not what I do." So he choked me out. And that's the only fighter I lost consciousness.
In the semifinal, Dan went up against Tank Abbott. The brawler from Huntington Beach, California was a fan favorite due to his everyman physique, brash demeanor, and devastating knockout power. Dan couldn't stand him.
He's probably the only person that I had any true ill intent for walking into the cage because of the antics that he would portray. There is a way of doing it. There's a classy way of doing it, and then there's the non-classy. I mean, simply go off and go into a tirade of F-bombs, that's the most basic and probably lowest common denominator way of doing something.
Tank qualified for the Ultimate by losing to Oleg Taktarov in the finals of UFC 6. The plan was simple. Dan had to get inside of Tank to eliminate his striking advantage and get him to the floor. Tank was known as a striker, but he actually had some grappling experience, having been an NJCAA All-American in college as a wrestler. Tank threw a haymaker and Dan ducked it, shooting for a takedown. Tank sprawled, delivering a knee to Dan's head in the process. They scrambled to their feet, and Severn pressed Tank into the fence. Once there, he threw Tank to the mat Greco style. He began an aggressive ground attack, blasting Tank with elbows, knees, and body blows. To preserve his hands, he threw palm strikes to Tank's face. He couldn't afford to be idle. Since his last UFC appearance, a rule was instituted for the sake of the fans. If the action stalled on the ground, Big John had the authority to restart the match from a standing position. Dan never let that happen, and after 18 minutes of punishment, Dan was declared the winner by unanimous decision.
The finals couldn't have been written up better. Dan Severn, winner of UFC 5, would face Oleg Taktarov in a rematch. After losing to Dan, Oleg returned to UFC 6 and won the tournament. Dan had a lot of respect for Oleg. He knew he would see a much better version of the Russian than in their last bout. Oleg began training at Ken Shamrock's Lions Den gym following UFC 5, which bore fruit at the beginning of the match. Dan and Oleg tied up, and Oleg rolled into a knee bar attempt.
The second time, Oleg had me dead to rights in a heel hook and that, and I was able to get out of that just by scrambling. I just know that I wasn't going to give it a second opportunity because I felt like I dodged a bullet the first time. But in that match alone, I think I delivered well over 300 headbutts in match number 2.
The finals had a time limit of 30 minutes, a 27-minute round, and a 3-minute overtime. Over the course of the regulation time period, Dan battered the tough Russian fighter. When the bell sounded, Oleg was bloody, but he wasn't going anywhere. To his credit, he kept walking forward in the overtime round, looking to engage in a striking match. Dan was way ahead on the scorecards at this point, and didn't take any chances. At one point, he dropped Oleg with a right hand, but let the Russian back up. In the end, Dan was awarded the title of Ultimate Champion by unanimous decision.
Dan was now a 2-time champion and had the right to challenge Shamrock for the super fight title. The rematch took place at UFC 9, Motor City Madness, on May 17, 1996. The event would be the first UFC to be held in Dan's home state of Michigan. Senator John McCain was on a mission to have mixed martial arts banned in the United States. He famously described UFC as human cockfighting, and was nearly successful in extinguishing the sport altogether. For UFC 9, UFC executives were locked into legal proceedings with the state of Michigan, trying to salvage the show.
They came to a compromise, and changed many aspects of a traditional UFC event. Some of these changes came just a few hours before the event was to begin. The tournament format was completely eliminated from the event for the first time. Each fight was standalone, like a boxing event. Other rules were handed down. Stomps and knees were illegal to a grounded opponent. So were elbows and closed fists to the face. The state of Michigan threatened that if any of these rules were violated, the fighter would be arrested on the spot. Dan was prepared to fight Ken under any rule set, but he wanted to see it for himself.
I've always been a curious George. I will always ask questions. So even though they came down with these new rules, and Big John's going through locker room after locker room, basically telling people what they can do, what they can't do, they're going to be warned. Well, how many warnings do you get there, Big John? Well, Severn, you will be warned. Well, I would watch the first match or two, just kind of get a feeling for what's happening. Yeah, I see Kel Worship go out there. He does headbutt after headbutt after headbutt. I hear warning, 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 and not a single penalty being administered. So what does that tell you? I mean, I'm an educated man that I don't simply just take stock in what someone says. I will go out there and do my own exploratory as well. That's what any intelligent competitor would do.
Dan didn't see any reason to abide by these last-minute changes. He was the hometown guy, and the crowd was frothing at the mouth, waiting for the beast to finally settle the score. Dan's game plan was to make Ken come to him, by any means necessary. In their last fight, Ken capitalized on Dan's aggression, and he wouldn't let that happen again.
I used basically certain principles of professional wrestling. I had to make it a crowd dislike a match. I made a crowd boo and hate a match. And in professional wrestling, you listen for what the crowd is popping on. I basically turned 10,000 people to dislike a match, and I made them work for me, and it affected my opponent Ken Shamrock because now he's talking to me. He's wanting to try to engage in the fight.
The bout was scheduled for 30 minutes. Ken took the center of the octagon, and Dan circled just out of range. And circled. And circled. Nothing was happening, and the crowd started to turn against Severn. Objects were being thrown in the ring. Big John screamed for action. It was just as Dan planned it. He would force Ken to engage first, and he didn't care if the entire capacity crowd fell asleep in the process. It took the entire regulation period, and most of the overtime, before Ken finally shot in. In the scramble, Dan wound up on top of Ken and started to mount an offense, striking with elbows and punches. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Dan to win a split decision victory. Dan had gotten his revenge. With that win, he became the UFC's first and only Triple Crown winner. He was a regular tournament champion, an Ultimate Champion, and now, Super Fight champion.
Dan didn't wait long to return to the ring, just not for the UFC. He went 5-0 touring the world in other organizations, including a 40-minute unanimous decision over Mario Neto. Dan came back to the UFC to defend his belt at UFC 12 in February 1997. His opponent was Mark the Hammer Coleman. Coleman stepped off the mats of the Olympic trials and into UFC 10. Mark had a strong wrestling pedigree. He was a national champion at Ohio State, a 5-time medalist in international competition, and a member of the 1992 Olympic team. The Hammer destroyed both UFC 10 and 11, making him 5-0 in his early MMA career. The sport continued to evolve, and UFC executives wanted to move away from the super fight system and start establishing weight classes. They began at UFC 12, where Dan, the super fight champion, would face Mark Coleman, the tournament champion, in a unification bout for the inaugural heavyweight championship.
Dan continued to split time between his business ventures, pro wrestling shows, and MMA bouts. He respected Mark's abilities, but didn't allow himself time to properly train and prepare. He was confident enough that he'd be able to pull out the win, just like he had many times before. Unfortunately, it was not to be. It took 3 minutes for Coleman to secure a neck crank, becoming the first heavyweight champion of the UFC. Coleman's win was seen as the next step in wrestling's invasion and dominance of the sport. Russ Hellickson, a silver medalist in the 1976 Olympic Games, was familiar with both men. He coached Mark at OSU. He not only tried to recruit Dan, but trained with him during his 76 run.
They're the fathers of a lot of aspects of what has made the MMA a very desirable and a very successful thing in the world. They laid the groundwork for a lot of that stuff. There's a lot of people that respect what they brought to the competition, and I have great respect for both Dan and for Mark for what they brought to MMA. They were pretty spectacular. I used to watch them compete and marveled at them.
Dan was the first man to represent amateur wrestling in the UFC. His success opened the door for countless other athletes. Before Dan, a wrestler only had 2 options out of college: the Olympics or professional wrestling. Once Dan suplexed Anthony Macias, skilled wrestlers had another avenue to still compete and make real money. Moreover, Dan's superior grappling showed how powerful the art really is, and was a precursor to wrestling's dominance. When you look at the championship history of the big organizations, many were and are wrestlers.
The proof is in the pudding. Look at where the sport is today. I know the mentality of a high-level wrestler. There is no comparison for the mental mindset and the work ethic.
Dan would not return to the cage for another 3 years. In that time, he went 27-1-3 against such names as Paul Buentello, Jeremy Horn, Travis Fulton, and Pat Miletich. He also finished Brad Kohler in devastating fashion.
We were not inside of a cage. We were inside of a professional wrestling ring. And he's got me backpedaling towards the ropes. And as my back is hitting the ropes, I think it's just one of a couple of things is about to happen here. So basically, I did a belly-to-belly, taking us both over the ropes. And there was a judge that was right there, the judge's table. We ended up, I think we broke the judge's arm, broke the judge's table. We come down, we smash onto, because this was an outdoor show on top of all that, and we hit, the asphalt. And all I know is that, when the match is done, I rolled right back into the ring, and I'm thinking, am I okay? Am I okay? Am I going, I don't think I got a scratch on me, and yet I think Brad was knocked out in that process, or injured, or a combination of both.
Of course, he continued wrestling around the country, and for a year, the WWF. Dan came in on the heels of Ken Shamrock, who was having success in the organization. WWF tried to play up their rivalry, but never materialized in the way the fans had hoped for. He entered the 1998 King of the Ring tournament with Shamrock on the opposite side of the bracket. It seemed like WWF was setting up Shamrock vs. Severn 3 for its final match. Instead, Dan lost to The Rock in the semifinals, and Ken won. For whatever reason, Dan could never find his footing in the WWF.
Maybe I was ahead of my time. Maybe they did not know what to do really with me. I know Jim Cornette was very frustrated during my professional career because, especially when I was working with the WWF at the time, in his words, he goes, Dan, you're the greatest thing to ever hit professional wrestling. You're a wrestler who actually can wrestle.
Maybe it was how Dan structured his contract.
The fact that I had a very unique contract there was no control over me and what I had to do. I was only contracted for 60 dates a year, not 187, only 60. But I was also unrestricted, meaning that I could work for the UFC, I could work for the NWA, I could work for WCW.
Dan theorized that WWF was scared to put a belt on him, in case he decided to up and leave. The final straw was when the writing team approached Dan for a new angle involving The Undertaker. Dan would write 666 on his forehead, the mark of the beast, and become Undertaker's disciple. He would be the first member of the Ministry of Darkness faction. Dan did not want to be associated with satanic imagery. His entire livelihood was based in a small, Catholic-fearing community. Many folks just didn't get the joke when it came to professional wrestling. He couldn't risk damaging his brand, and left the organization.
Dan grew his training facility into a full-fledged, state-of-the-art training center. Luke Zachrich, a UFC vet and tough alum, started his career there. He took us back to that first day.
Yeah, here I am. I'm a pretty big, in-shape, athletic guy who thought I was pretty tough. And I just remember it was an hour and a half drive to go to Dan's gym. And the nerves that I felt that day going up there, I was pretty terrified, but excited to meet with Dan, or meet somebody like Dan who had the resume, the legendary status, everything along those lines. But I was terrified at the same time. So I remember walking in, and he had an office that sat off to the right when you would enter the gym. And all I see is this guy with this like massive watermelon head. I mean, it was the biggest head I've ever seen on somebody in my entire life. And I'm like, holy shit, that's Dan Severn. And I kind of knock on the door, and he's like, hey, how you doing? Like, here, I think he's this killer. And he was like the nicest, most humble person I'd ever met my entire life, with this very unassuming, non-frightening demeanor.
Paul Bowers trained with Dan for years and became head instructor for a time.
What it was, hey, it's kind of, this is his style of fighting, adding in, the striking aspect. It was basically, how to learn how to be a great wrestler in MMA is what our whole gym was based on. And, wrestlers as well as anyone else, they're gritty people, so we attracted a lot of wrestlers. He always did.
It was simply ahead of its time and was an oasis in the Midwest for many prospective MMA and pro wrestling athletes.
There is no such thing as an MMA gym. I mean, they might have had a couple out in California. I think Couture had his Team Quest with Henderson and Lindland. So there are so few gyms. Still to this day, I mean, I've been in some of probably the top gyms in the entire world. And to me, Dan Severn's Michigan Sports Camp is still probably the coolest gym I've ever been in. He had 2 separate wrestling rooms. He had one room that had a ring in it, another room that had a ring and bags. And then what was the coolest part about it, on both ends of the gym, it was like a massive bunk room. So I think the gym slept like comfortably 70 people. He had this like massive commercial kitchen, a weight room, nothing like it. Those are the days when you had to go to a boxing gym to train boxing, go to a high school to train wrestling. Here, Dan had this all under one facility. So it was really incredible there, because there were some really, really good, talented guys that were living and training there. A lot of guys coming in all over the place, and the classes were just a room full of killers at the time.
Many MMA stars got their start at Dan's training center, such as Rampage Jackson, Rashad Evans, and Sean Shirk. In fact, it was Dan who got Rashad onto the second season of The Ultimate Fighter.
I take a great deal of pride in what I teach and how I teach. I have a teaching degree from Arizona State University. I received that in 1986. I started teaching the sport of amateur wrestling in 1971 or 72. I'd rather be out on the mat teaching more than anything, because that is something I have a real gift for. And you've heard of Heinz 57, the ketchup. It's full of different kinds of ingredients. Well, when I go out there and I teach, I always tell people I'm teaching as Heinz 57. These are all of my ingredients. I have a folk style amateur wrestling background. I have a freestyle wrestling background. I've got a Greco-Roman wrestling background. I took a judo class in 1976 at Arizona State University. I jumped into judo competition. I jumped into the sambo national championships without ever taking a single sambo class or even owning a sambo jacket.
Luke Zachrich knew Dan was a great instructor right away.
instantly the one thing that Dan carried is he instantly had your respect. Like, he could break something down. This guy can dummy down a move and really explain it in the most simplest form that it just sticks. So even to this day, I mean, when I was actively fighting in the UFC and other stuff, and I'm, coaching 50 guys at the time or something, like, I literally tried to take the approach that Dan took, and I tried to simplify everything.
In 1999, Severn founded the Danger Zone, an MMA event that focused on amateur athletes. He wanted to give the boys he was training a platform to showcase their skills. It was an important organization for many fighters' careers. Although the Danger Zone folded, Michigan Sports Camps is still in business today.
Dan began fighting at the age of 36 and finished his career with a staggering record of 101, 19, and 7. He competed for more organizations than there are letters in the alphabet. He was in the very first Pride event and the first WEC show. He fought for major organizations like King of the Cage, Super Brawl, and Rings.
Tell me any other fighter that you can think of,
Paul Bowers,
offhand, that has had as many fights as he has against that high level of competition. I mean, he used to fight guys virtually every weekend that were like one-loss records, getting ready to, they were trying to get a shot in the big shows. Their management set this up. They did it right. Okay, all you got to do is beat Dan. You beat him, we'll get you in. And it never came to fruition very often. I mean, he's beat more names. Everybody, you're going to fight a guy every once in a while, it's got a losing record or whatever, but look at the guys he's fought. I mean, you can go through there and go, wow, he fought that guy, and then 2 weeks later, he fought that guy. And then 2 weeks later, he fought that guy. And you're like, holy shit.
He fought for numerous smaller shows, many times as the main event. His name on the marquee brought attention to the local talent. He collected 3 more championship belts from Elite One, Continental Free Fighting Alliance, and Gladiator Challenge. Luke put it simply.
Anybody that fought back in those days had basically fought Dan. I mean, if you look down through his resume, I mean, it's so impressive, some of the guys that he fought. You could talk who's who of guys that are literally legends in the sport, and Dan smashed most of them.
Being a champion is more than just holding a belt.
You're not just a champion at one point in time, and then you just lay down. I mean, I'll say a true champion will be a champion their entire life. They may not be that competitor anymore, but it's the way that they'll still carry themselves. It's the way that they'll engage people in conversation. It's the way that they'll talk about their pedigree. It's the way that they'll talk about the industry in general. They care about it. They have their pound of flesh literally has been invested into it. It's something that you can't say you just walked away from and you gave a couple of years of your life. No, it literally has taken something away from you as well in order to be successful.
Travis Fulton is more experienced fighting Dan than anyone else. Both men had unbelievably long careers, during a time when most fights had very limited rules and regulations. He has a lot of respect for him.
I mean, because, you can say whatever about Hoist Gracie. Hoist Gracie took on a bunch of karate and taekwondo guys who had no fucking idea what the hell they were doing. It's like putting a boxer in a wrestling match. I mean, if you pin him, why does that make you a badass? Dan was the first UFC fighter, first fighter in MMA to actually go out there and really dominate the sport. He was the first guy who went out there and really earned the title as, like the first superstar of the sport.
As might be expected, Dan didn't forget about professional wrestling either. His list of accomplishments in that arena is just as astounding. On top of being a 3-time NWA champion, Dan won 9 belts in other organizations. He was inducted into the NWA, LPW, and WAR Wrestling Halls of Fame. Moreover, he is the only person to be honored by the George Tragos Lou Thez Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame 3 times.
Dan retired from MMA competition on January 1st, 2013. He remains busier than ever, and continues packing his schedule with wrestling shows, appearances, seminars, and acting gigs. Dan reflected on his career.
I've been competing longer than most people have been alive. I don't look like a 61-year-old cat. I don't move like a 61-year-old cat. And I'm enjoying life just by being Dan Severn.
He shared a stark fact with us.
I've already outlived, I think now 6 of my cage fighting opponents and 30 or more of my professional wrestling partners. And none of them were as old as me. But it's called lifestyle choices.
He's also an entrepreneur, investing in the growing CBD market.
It's called Level 5, the number 5, Level 5 custom processing is the parent type of organization, but we also have ranch CBD, which is more towards the veterinarian side, dogs, cats, horses. But then there's also been Dan Severn CBD, which is more the tinctures and the balms for athletes. I say for athletes, but just for anyone that a senior citizen is going to derive benefits from it because CBD is an anti-inflammatory. So DanSevernCBD.com.
You might be surprised to learn that Dan wasn't initially thrilled about being called the Beast. He didn't want to be defined by such a fearsome moniker. Instead, he crafted his nickname into an acronym to better suit how he approached life. To Dan, the stands for
Teacher, humanitarian, and educator.
Beast stands for
Believe in yourself, educate yourself, adjust your attitude, study hard, and teach others.
Dan was not a fighter. I never thought of him as like a fighter. I think a lot of people do. But I mean, I know him as just a relentless competitor. Like, that's how he's always been. It doesn't matter what you're doing. Since I've known him, I've known him since I was a kid. You know, I'm 35 years old. I still talk to him occasionally. He's just a competitor, man. Like, it's not. There's no emotion involved as far as like, I'm gonna beat this dude up. I'm gonna beat his ass, or I'm gonna get pumped. I'm gonna knock him out. It's like, no, I'm gonna beat him because that's my job. Because I'm gonna beat him and I'm gonna beat the next guy. Beat this guy because that's what I'm getting paid to do is beat this guy, and I'm a competitor. He loves competing, you know. Still to this day, doesn't matter what you do against him, he's still gonna try to beat you at whatever he's doing.
Dan Severn's legacy is chiseled into the foundation of MMA. He humbly conquered the amateur wrestling, professional wrestling, and mixed martial arts arenas. He did it the only way he knows how, with class, diligence, dignity, and one hell of a mustache.
Like what you just heard? Check us out on Twitter and Instagram at MMA TRUFAN. You can also find us on Facebook and YouTube. Please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. Special thanks to Dan Severn, Russ Hellickson, Don Frye, Paul Bowers, Luke Zachrich, Travis Fulton, and Paul Varelans. Music by With Lions Productions. Artwork by Mike Zandt.